Welcome back to the Texas Appellate Law Podcast. I'm Jody Sanders.
And I'm Todd Smith.
And our guest today is Casey Ashmore of the Ashmore and Ashmore Law Firm in Rockwall, Texas. Casey, thanks for joining us.
Thank you both for the invite. It's a privilege to be here.
Well, Casey, some of our listeners may know who you are just from social media and, just general lawyering stuff throughout the state. But tell us a little bit about yourself, maybe your background, kind of how you got to the practice of law.
Well, interesting story. Young kid from Houston, Texas, grew up in a military family. I have a vivid recollection that I share with a very close friend of mine, Xavier Herrera. We both got dropped off at the Military Entrance Processing Center on San Jacinto Street in Houston, Texas at 5 a.m. at different points in our life. X-Man ended up in the Marine Corps. I was a few years behind him, and I ended up in the United States Coast Guard. And I remember as I was getting out of the U.S. Coast Guard that I wanted to continue to have a job where I felt like I made a difference. And one of the things that attracted me, even while I was still doing that, was the practice of law. So I made a decision early on to pursue that and did that. And that, I think, besides having kids, it may be one of the greatest privileges in my life is to have been afforded that opportunity to be a lawyer in Texas and been doing it for a minute. And I think that everybody who does this job feels that way. But the closest thing about that I take away, maybe I cherish, is that it really does feel like I'm still in the rescue business, like very much like what I did when I was in the U.S. Coast Guard.
I like that. I think that's a good analogy to think about in law in particular. And you have kind of a small firm and you do just a general practice, a little bit of everything.
We do. We have 4 attorneys, and my wife and business partner, Jennifer, does personal injury and criminal defense. I assist on some of those matters, but I do civil litigation and heavy family law. We have a great teammate, Brad Johnson, who's also a veteran, a 26-year Navy corpsman, 14 of those in the Marine Corps. Brad is a family law specialist. And we have another colleague, Jen Smith, who's been practicing about, I think, 18 or 19 years. And she really loves probate the most, but we drag her into the other phrase as needed or desired sometimes. So we're real lucky to have those. To have that team, because we can serve our community, smaller counties, general practice counties, Rockwall, Hunt County, Kaufman. You have those courts of general jurisdiction, and not saying anything about specialty courts, because I think we get very lucky in our larger counties for those specialty courts and specialty judges. And that's happening at the Court of Appeals now, a specialty court of appeals. That we're going back to that, where at some point we had gone away and had generalized courts of appeals. And I think that's a smart thing to do, is to return to those specialties. But in these smaller communities, you do what your courthouse does. And so that's kind of the idea behind what we do.
Well, it sounds like you've got a really well-rounded group doing on the civil litigation side. And you made the point that, Jenny gets pulled in. Jenny was her name?
Mm-hmm.
I want to make sure I get that right. You made the point that Jenny gets kind of pulled in on other stuff besides her preferred probate matters. I mean, that's kind of the nature of a general civil practice.
It is, yes. But many hands make light work. And I will say that although I do love estate planning, and memory serves, I think one of my better grades in school was trusts and estates. And that being said, the advocacy of the courtroom, I think, still calls all of us to some degree. Mm-hmm. So jumping into the well and talking to the jury and prepping the clients and the things the nitty gritty that makes, rolling up your sleeves and kind of digging into the issues and even briefing some of those issues. And most especially, I think, the persuasive speaking that we get to engage with, just generally the trial court level, but being prepared for that. And, the challenge of that, I think, attracts all of us, especially when you're focused on client-facing services, and then you get into a different one where it's client-facing, but with a big point on advocacy, right? The tip of the spear, when this hearing sets the tone for the remainder of the case, or at least a portion of the remainder of the case. And that's a fun thing to be able to do.
So what did your career path look like out of law school? Did you hang out your own shingle to start, or what'd you do to kind of get where you are?
No, I attribute my career path mostly to being a big fan of John Grisham, and I think a lot of students who went to school when I did what we all were, or at least I haven't polled the whole audience, but I think a lot of us read his books. And I took the go learn your craft for 10 years and then go out and start saving the world one case at a time. I probably took that a little too close to heart, but that is exactly what I did. I was really lucky. I worked for Judge Elizabeth Ray in Harris County, Texas, as a Harris County assistant district clerk. It was a great job in law school. It taught me a lot about civil litigation, rules of procedure. That helped me get a job at the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. I was lucky enough to work for the Honorable Barbara Hervey, who just retired last year. I worked for her for 2 terms, and then I had 2 different tenures at 2 different civil insurance defense firms in Dallas, Hawkins and Parnell, and later that was Hawkins, Parnell, Thaxton, and then Chambly and Ryan. Got a lot of great experience, and I had a lot of fun and made some really great friends that I still have to this day. Every once in a while, I'll bug David Walsh and Todd Allen and Pete Anderson and Jeff Kershaw and a lot of those battle buddies from that group. And of course, Rob Gilbreth is somebody, I think y'all probably know him. He might have even been
Sure.
on this show, but Rob was a great mentor at Hawkins and really instrumental in teaching some great things about persuasive writing. Not only kind of filling in the void where I won't say law school wasn't helpful. I just think that the writing classes in law school were very compressed and almost a
Yeah.
reverse of the way we learned to write in undergrad in some ways, right? We went from a mostly passive prose voice to a very active issue rule application conclusion voice. And that wasn't an easy transition for everybody. I think I'm included in that. And then, being lucky enough to work with somebody like Rob, who was a great teacher. And David was also a great teacher about making sure things are in the record, because if it's not in the record, the trial judge can't review it. And if it's not there for the trial judge, it's not there for the appellate court. And just those were great. So that 10 years was fantastic for learning and being mentored. I'm a big proponent of being mentored and learning, and I'm grateful for those groups of attorneys that invested in me. It's a blessing, in my opinion.
Well, on the subject of learning from people and kind of a small world, I actually interned for Judge Ray's court when I was in law school one summer.
Oh my gosh.
Got to know all the people in that chambers, and they were great. And they helped me end up finding a job working as a law clerk in that courthouse. So they invested in me, and for years, I would still see all of them when I go down to Harris County for hearings and go to lunch with them and all that. That's funny. But they were super good about that too. Taking time with a law student and explaining, here's what this is and here's what that is. Just invaluable stuff.
That is such a small world. I just tried a case with another Houston lawyer, Kraft Hughes. I don't know if you know him. But he also worked at Judge Ray's court. He's yet another one of the trial attorneys or I believe that's mostly what I understood Kraft to do. He's a trial attorney in Harris County, and what a small and awesome little ripple effect that has had on so many attorney students. That's an interesting connection, and I do very much miss the writing over to NINFAs with the crew of the 165th. I think back when Metro still had those trolley buses that you could ride over to NINFAs for free during the lunch period, which was perfect when you're in law school, right? You're always looking for how can I make
something cheap,
cheap, and I don't have to move my vehicle and pay another parking fee in downtown Houston.
You talk about paths crossing it. Rob Gilbreth was, I think, about 2 years ahead of me, and he clerked for the same judge that I did at the Supreme Court, Raul Gonzalez. And so I've known Rob for many years. And then you mentioned Kraft Hughes, who's somebody that I've come across. And every time we think about the sheer number of lawyers in our state, it's like 115,000 or something now. That's a crazy number. The fact that you hear the same names over and over again and you come across the same people, it's not unique. I mean, appellate practice is sort of unique in that in any other practice, you do that happens more than probably in appellate practice than any other. But, Kraft is not an appellate lawyer, and he lives in Houston. I live in Austin. And yet, you mentioned him, Casey, and Jody's nodding his head along too. So I'm like, it's funny how you come across the same people over and over again doing the practice of law, which I think kind of reinforces the broader point you're making, which is it's important to maintain relationships and mentor other lawyers and behave yourself, by the way, because you never know when you're going to come across this person again and what influence they're going to have on things that are happening in your case. So I'm always just struck by the fact that our bar is so big, and yet people's names just seem to bubble up to the surface among other people that I know that you would not know there would be any connection with whatsoever.
Yes. And I didn't even realize it was 115,000. I know it had grown quite a bit. And you're absolutely right. The fact that we're all in different areas in the state, and that case that Kraft and I tried was in Denton County, Texas, not a place that either of us are regularly at, which the court joked about from time to time.
Out of towners.
The out of towners, the U-haulers, or whatever the joke was. But that's a great reminder about courtesy and one of the things, you're absolutely right, behaving yourself, because we do put on the boxing gloves and have to jump into the well and be the advocates for each other. And doing so, you got to separate that, make sure it's not a personal attack. And I think most of us get that. And sometimes that's difficult when the fighting gets contentious, as it tends to do.
No question.
And you're absolutely right. I remember not that long ago, a much more senior attorney. I don't know if y'all ever heard of Holly Gotcher. She's out of Greenville, Texas, and she is maybe one of the most distinguished advocates and fiercest advocates I've ever been in a trial. And I've had several, but the first time I was really impressed with how aggressive she was, and then how polite and courteous and sincere, polite and courtesy at the end of the battle. Truly walked over, shook everybody's hand. I had notions of, this is why Rocky Balboa and Apollo Creed became best friends, right? It's because the way in which the fight ended, right, is just absolute mutual respect. No matter how the verdict came down, absolute mutual respect. And I told her that the next time I saw her in court, and she was, I think, kind of surprised and moved about that. But it was just a great reminder about the professionalism that we need to show each other, because you're absolutely right. You're going to see Rob Gilbreth probably as attorney for the other side on something at some point, or if you're lucky, co-counsel, counsel.
Yeah.
But or David Walsh or Kraft, running into him again after almost 2 decades, which was, what a surprise. Even with you're absolutely right, 115,000, and we're practicing law all over the state. Meeting him on the far western end of the DFW Metroplex. And that's not the furthest I've had a case, and I imagine both of you as well, probably been as far as the 55th District Court, which I can't remember if that's far or Harlingen, but I know it's far, far south. And that may be the furthest case I've ever had. Again, those are attorneys that I might only see twice ever, but they'll remember how you made them feel when you were there.
Absolutely.
And trying to make a professional, at a minimum, impression, even if you're doing your job and have to take a hard stance in those unpleasant moments, and then taking the gloves off and being a professional after the fact. Critical. Agree.
Yeah, it does. It does make a huge difference, and it does leave an impression, because I remember the lawyers who walked out in a huff after a hearing, or, it's one of those things that kind of sticks with you, and it changes the way that you interact with them in the future.
It does.
Yeah, we could probably make this whole episode about war stories.
Yeah.
Dealing with opposing counsel, and we're talking about the right way to do it, and then we could, if we wanted to, we could talk about all the wrong ways that we've all come across over decades of practicing law. Maybe we'll do that another time.
Yeah, I think that's
it would be interesting to do that.
Well, to change topics a little bit, I'm curious. So you worked at the CCA, and then you did insurance defense for about 10 years, and then you kind of transitioned to doing your own thing, small firm type setting. How'd you do pick up the skills to kind of do a general practice? Because I mean, I know what my day in, day out has looked like in law firm life, and I know what my friends do at insurance defense firms. Where do you pick up the skills to do things like family, criminal, wills and trust type stuff when you didn't really do that before?
Well, a couple things. I think flipping from Judge Ray's court, which was just 100% a specialized court, from working there, it was a civil district court in Harris
Yep.
County, to the Court of Criminal Appeals, which is nothing but criminal appeals and capital murder cases, was a lot of what we did back then, because there were a lot. We were dealing with all the cases from the 1990s, where especially Harris County was seeking, because of the nature of those extremely violent crimes from that time period, capital or life without parole type punishments. And that was a lot of change, and it was really fast. And I was encouraged by Judge Ray and Judge Hervey and of course I gotta give a shout out to Judge Mike Kiesler, who I don't know if you've ever met him, but he was just one of the funniest and greatest mentors I've ever had. And he had a great joke about the Court of Criminal Appeals. He's like, you know why they call us judges, Casey? It's because there's no justice on the Court of Criminal Appeals. Anyway, that one liner though, but just a reminder that everything you learned in law school and everything you learned working for Judge Ray, those are all the tools you need to learn this job. And you can apply that same set of learning skills, because what you've done in law school is given yourself the ability to educate yourself about different areas of law. And insurance defense was heavily specialized. You're absolutely right, but it's heavy civil litigation. Family law is heavy civil litigation, and it's code specific. So it's, especially now in the last 10 years, the family code has really grown, and the practice, I would say, mirrors more the Texas rules of appellate procedure, with the procedural guffaws and errors that can be made even with a well-intentioned attorney who just doesn't know enough, just because of the way the legislature has had to redo the family code. And that all being said, being given the confidence that you can educate yourself about it and do it, and being encouraged to do that by mentors like Bill Shambly. He was 100% a big proponent of, you can do this, you're smart enough. In fact, I'm going to make you do it. You will figure this out. Not exactly like a high school football coach, but not far from that either. That gave a lot of confidence in being able to do that. And then I got some other great advice when I started. My wife and I started this law firm, and part of that was out of, just a desire to be closer to family. Our boys came along, and I'm a proud father of 4. I was a single dad when I was in law school. I had 2 little girls. They're wonderful. We just had their birthdays. But I was away a lot at the desk working and studying. And so when the boys came along, I knew I didn't want to miss it. And we decided to make a life change and start this law firm. And that was, I think, one of the best decisions I've ever made in my life. Then I got some really good advice right after that, which was from a neighbor at the grocery store who's also an attorney, and he highly recommended the Texas Bar College as a way to stay really on the cutting edge of what you need to know in not just your practice, but literally every practice area in the state of Texas, just so when these tangential weird things happen in our lives, like you have a water rights issue pop up in the middle of a family law case, or something unexpected, a land right matter comes up, you are not blindsided with no knowledge of that. And the Texas Bar College, for those who don't know, is like super CLE for those of us who are part of it and have been part of it. I think that was one of the greatest hacks. I wouldn't call it I heard the term cheat code or something like that. There's really no you have to do the work. You have to take the CLE, and I think they've reduced the hours just a tiny bit over the last 10 years, but it's still more than double what the minimum requirement is. And I do remember the difference between me as somebody who did the 15 to 20 hours a year that we're required to do by the state bar, and the difference within 2 years of being a bar college member, with the ability to just have an education about, or know what to research just by doing that extra work, going that extra mile. And that helped a lot. But who really encouraged that? I'd have to say it was Ray, Hervey and Chambly, right? Just really pushed the idea that you can do this and you can educate yourself about it.
How do you build a business? You've been working in a big city, kind of doing a bigger firm type thing, and you moved to, I guess, a smaller town, do a small up. I mean, how do you build your business? What was your approach with that?
You've got to, in my opinion, well, couple things. You've got to do a few things to break through obscurity. And I think critically, you got to find a tribe that you really are close to and identify with. And for me, in this community, in these communities, it's been getting connected with a veterans group. That
Mm.
that that and veteran outreach is something really close to my heart. It's something that I think our whole state, especially, but maybe our whole nation, the perception of how we handle veterans issues has changed since I got out. I'm a pre 9/11 veteran, and my perception, I think, is a lot closer to the way my father felt when he got out. He was a Vietnam era veteran. I would say that veteran issues and veteran services were a little a little less important pre 2004. And after
Sure.
that really seemed to change significantly, right? Because we said, almost I think maybe 100,000 young men and women over to war for about 2 decades. When you do that, you're going to have people come back. They're going to have issues, and we've figured that out with things like veterans courts and better access to service. But finding groups that speak to your heart, whether that is your favorite charity or some outreach services for children, I think that is one of my mentors at Hawkins Parnell, Al Parnell, used to say that's a paycheck to the heart, right? When you
I
do
like
work
that.
like that and you don't mind doing extra work like that. And that really helps you break out of obscurity because you're doing something you love and are passionate about. And you don't mind if you have to stay a little longer on a Friday night to go to a veteran organization or to your favorite charity, or you're at a board meeting early on a Saturday morning because you're doing something that fills you up. And through that, because you're not there to take anything, right? You're going to break through obscurity, and you're going to open up what I believe is known as the paradigm of giving, if I'm saying it right, which is the notion that the more you give, the more you will receive. And I know that's not a new notion. My friend Trace says that a lot, but I think I've heard that in a Napoleon Hill recording from the 1930s. I mean, this is not a new idea. This notion that giving of yourself, it probably comes even from the Bible or other religious teachings. I wouldn't be surprised if it was everywhere, because it seems to be a kind of a universal truth that giving of yourself opens the door for people to recognize, appreciate, and then help you break through that obscurity, which you got to have to start attracting the kind of clients you want. And then, of course, what John Grisham said, do good work. The work will then begin to speak for itself. And it doesn't it doesn't hurt to get some help with social media, especially this day and age, because as I think that's how all three of us met, right? I'm a
Hmm.
fan of y'all's on social media, and Doug Gladden is a friend of mine and also a fan of y'all's. But it's those connections that completely unknown that begin to promote different things in your business, mostly positive, I think, if you use them positively.
So besides Texas Bar College, I mean, I appreciate what you said about the college and finding a tribe, and I agree generally with everything you said. Are there other bar related activities that you've done that you think have helped you find your moorings in your career and maybe helps your firm?
Absolutely. When I was in Dallas, practicing and living in Dallas County, and very active member and a big fan of the Dallas Bar Association. That
Hmm.
is a phenomenal group, still is. And one of the tribes that I got teamed up with there is Al Ellis and the
Hmm.
DBA Habitat for Humanity build. And
Hmm.
for many years, that was and still to a degree, a big passion. As the Saturdays they belong to your kids right now. So there'll be a chapter to revisit that. And I'm really grateful that that group understands that and that they're carrying that forward. Actually, Brad Johnson, my colleague, that's how we met. He likes to tell people that I'm his only friend that he met on a roof. We met on a Habitat for Humanity roof. I don't even remember how many years ago. He does, but it's been a minute. Maybe it's 12 or 14 years ago. And Brad, and then I have another very close friend, Greg McAllister, who's an employment lawyer in Dallas. We also met at Habitat for Humanity, and other people, the friends and neighbors in the community. We actually, at one point with that group, built a Habitat house here in Terrell, Texas. The police department had knocked down a drug house across the street from a church just a few blocks from here, and they put a Habitat house up after they knocked down that home. And that, again, those anchor houses start to transform neighborhoods. I think that's maybe one of the best things the Dallas Bar has in its outreach. Not the best, but one of. And got to meet a lot of our Dallas judges through that, and some of them have moved on and retired, but many of them are still there. Martin Hoffman and others who are, always avid, coming out there swinging hammers or painting things and not afraid to engage in that one day of really fun, hard work. And the other part of it, which is tough, which is asking people for money, right? Being, hey, would you be a donor? And it's not something we're used to doing. And it's awkward, but when you're passionate about it, right, that's just a great way to get connected with a huge group of people. And one of the directors of Habitat is a friend and neighbor out here in McLennan Chisholm now. And it's just weird how those connections just continue on. So that's Dallas Bar co-chair for 3 or 4 terms, a couple of those with Brad Johnson, a couple with Greg McAllister, Rockwall Bar Association for many years. Judge Winters in Van Zandt County and I have put on a mental health continuing education, which we are overdue for putting on this year's, but we got Jay Spring and a few other attorneys, Judge McKee from Henderson County. We put together a mental health bench bar, and we want to make that an annual. Right now it's an occasionally annual, but the goal is to make it an annual, just because we've had in our community, we've had some tragedies, whether that be just normal health related, or, some of them are unfortunately people in this business who've made that ultimate decision to take their own life. And so that's something that has affected those judges in particular, where they don't have a lot of attorneys. And it was something that Judge Winters approached me about to put together and revisit that, because if we're not talking about those things, they tend to get stuffed down, and that's where the bad habits can become a problem.
We're in an interesting time with technology kind of having taken off. I mean, it was already there, but that just where our industry as a whole is kind of facing, some would even call it maybe existential crisis. I'm not sure I would go that far, but would you say that being so plugged in? I mean, I think I know the answer to this question, but let me say it a little differently and see if this will spark another line of conversation. I'm hearing, and I've always heard, complaints from solo and small firm lawyers that, well, I don't really need the State Bar of Texas. What does the bar really do for me? And I hear this sort of theme through what you're talking about, KC. Well, it's a great way to plug and play and to meet people and to get, connected and all that. I mean, I agree with that 100%, but, you talk about being connected to judges, and you talk about connecting to colleagues that you might not otherwise have had any relationship with beyond being elbow to elbow with them, say on a Texas Bar College, committee or something like that. I mean, what would you say? Would you add anything to what I just went through about, to those who think that once they get their law degree, that they've got everything they need to go out and make a bunch of money as a lawyer?
I would highly encourage the connection through the bar associations, and especially the state bar. One of the things that I thought was really lucky, and you only get invited to this CLE if you're a officer. I think you have to be a president or a vice chair, however you're organized. The Bar Leaders Conference, which is, I think it's also a bar college class. But that networking group with all the bar leaders from all the local bar associations across the state, Lubbock, Amarillo, those are invaluable people to meet. And you may not see them again till the next year. Most of the bar associations have you on like a 3-year. I think a lot of them are organized that way, right? Your vice 1 year, your lead 1 year, your vice the next year, outgoing vice the next year. But that way there's continuation of care. And so you're going to connect with those people. And then not only is that an awesome, lot of fun, great networking opportunity for really diverse group of people that how often are you going to be learning and hanging out with and having a laugh at casino night? Or I think maybe my most memorable, my wife and I love the raffle baskets. Everybody brought a
Mhm.
favorite things basket. And that's actually something we've carried forward for giveaways at that mental health conference was the favorite things basket. People loved that. Here's all of our favorite things from Terrell, Texas, or Rockwall and Terrell, or whatever it might
Hmm.
be, Waxahachie, Texas, and salsa, coffee, a gift card to a dinner place, whatever it might be, just some fun things. And not only that, but then going to a state bar. I love to crash the state bar when they do it at the Hilton Anatole. Just come in, you don't register before, just show up, pay the pay the day of the door, because you never know if you can get 3 or 4 days off anyway. It's hard.
Yeah.
Just trying to get that amount of time out of the office, it's tough. It's so much fun. And I saw so many people at those events. And more than that, I was introduced to so many. The last time the state bar conference was at the Anatole, I ran into one of our DAs here in this community and one of our judges who had just retired. And they both dragged me into their college, their whatever university they went to, whatever law school it was. I can't remember if it was Texas or SMU or whatever, but they dragged me into those rooms for those. And I met so many people, some of whom I knew and some of whom I didn't know. So I do think that that is a really important one-on-one. If you can make time for the state bar, it's tough to make time for the state bar because it's a big time commitment. At
Hmm.
one point, I was on my law school, South Texas College of Law's board, and that's very tough as well because that requires a couple of trips to Houston a year. So I got big respect for people who can dedicate the time to do that, and not all of us can. But certainly going to the events and seeing your peers, even if you can just show up for half of an afternoon and stick around for the networking, because you can get a lot of good out of it and you can have a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So
I have a hard time thinking about what it would be like as a brand new lawyer today, trying to start from scratch without the benefit of those sorts of mentoring relationships that you describe, KC, and being plugged into a firm. And you hear more and more, I think we're turning out a lot of lawyers in our state, and not everyone is
Hmm.
finding great jobs out of law school. And so some people are taking, or deliberately taking, the entrepreneurial path and starting their firms right out of school. And I just, as we know, law school doesn't really teach you everything you need to know
Hmm.
to practice law. And so, I mean, I'm biased because I've been very involved in various bar organizations throughout my career. And so I see the value inherent in that. And I tend to kind of roll my eyes when I hear, the example that I gave earlier about new lawyers, especially, or sometimes even older lawyers who are disgruntled for whatever reason at the bar, saying, well, what does the bar really do for me? And I just view it as there's so much opportunity to kind of have a substitute or an addition to the kinds of experiences that you get in a more traditional law practice environment if you can find your tribe, as you say.
yeah.
And so that, again, I'll admit my bias there, but I do like hearing the kinds of stories that you're telling, because to me, it just kind of reaffirms that, look, your bar membership, yeah, it's not inexpensive to be a member of the Texas bar. That's the cost of doing business. It's the cost of regulation and self-regulation, mind you, because I can get on my soapbox about do we really want the bureaucrats telling us what we can and can't do? We're privileged to be a self-regulated profession, and it should stay that way. And a lot of what you're saying just kind of reaffirms, and maybe it's confirmation bias or whatever you want to call it. It's nice to hear someone who's taken a little bit different path. You started off in a clerkship, but you went into a couple of firms and had that traditional path for a while. And I guess you're maybe not quite the test case for what I'm talking about, because you did have the benefit of some of those law firm mentoring relationships, but now you're on the end of it, of your name's on the door. And so, I think hearing what you're describing about the relationships that you built is wonderful. You mentioned the lawyers in your firm. I'll just put you on the spot. Do you establish relationships with law students or clerks or anything like that to where you are mentoring younger lawyers yourself?
We have high school students
Yeah.
who my wife is close to one of our DAs in this area, and the two of them are, I think, responsible for most of the mentoring for the high school law clerks. So we've had some really great kids over the years, and I'm also extremely grateful for our paralegals, especially Madison McMahon, who keeps them busy, gives them stuff to do, teaches them things, and works with them because they often share her office, and her office has 2 desks. Sorry,
Oh.
Madison. But that has been really, really fun and interesting. Usually they get to do, with school permission, they get to do a ride along and go to court for a
Ooh,
day, which is a lot of fun.
that's cool.
Yeah.
And then occasionally there are other opportunities where uh, a friend of ours has reached out about my son's thinking about going to law school or perhaps joining the military. So I had the good fortune of taking my friend's son to not only court for a day, he got to do a ride along. He was debating law school. He's at UT Law now, so I guess we made his mind up. But I also took him to a veteran networking event because he was debating joining the Air Force and then making a run to get into the Space Force because he's very interested in aerospace. So we totally lucked out because one of my close friends' sons, Quint Avenetti's son, he was one of the first selected for Space Force. So that's what he does now. And I don't know what the Guardians, I think that's what they're called. So he was one of the
Guardians.
first Guardians ever, the first class of Guardians, which is right. I mean, that's a pretty cool thing, especially as that really becomes the next most important part of aerospace and defense in the world, to be on the cutting edge of that. And so they had some really cerebral conversations about aerospace defense and what that might look like if he chose to go that route. But ultimately, he applied to UT Law, so we won him. We won him over. But those are fun opportunities, and getting a chance to do that is super cool. We had a young, I still see his dad every once in a while. We had a young man named Charlie, and Charlie worked for us for one summer. I think Charlie's going to be a Supreme Court justice at some point, but he went to college and then law school in Alabama, and he's an attorney now in Dallas, works for John Crusoe. And again, back to what's the point of the networking and I'll give you maybe one of my strangest for some, but also one of my greatest takeaways from that. John Crusoe and I met when he was still judge in Dallas, and I can't remember what criminal court number he was. It might have been 3. It might have been 11. I don't remember. He was still a sitting judge there. We met on a road trip on the Dallas Bench Bar back when they did it in the Hill Country, and we rode motorcycles down together. And we probably did that for the better part of a decade. That we'd only see each other about once a year or so on that trip, and we have remained friends ever since. But that is a connection that you're only going to make by going to one of those events, right?
Mhm.
9 times out of 10, when you're in front of insert name of any judge or justice, you're there for a professional service reason. You're not there for, hey, I'm just going to get to know you for a minute. We're going to talk about barbecue. We're going to talk about what you like about this bike or that bike or the Rangers or the Cowboys or whatever your family, the peach cobbler, doesn't matter. It's not law stuff. And you'd only get those opportunities from putting yourself in a position to be mentored like that. And you're also going to learn probably some great things about advocacy. There's no judge who won't share with you some advocacy tips when you're just in a casual setting. Or at least that's my experience. They're more often very willing to do that. And also just getting a connection outside of that, putting on the suit and they're wearing the
Mhm.
robe, and they can't be your friend in that scenario.
Oh, yeah. That's an important point, that you may develop these personal relationships, but it doesn't mean that you're going to get any special favors.
Nope.
It's important. I think maybe what I would say on that is it's really nice when you go into the courthouse and the judges know your name and they know you from your volunteer work. They know you from your spending of your time, and they know you over time. They get to know you as an advocate too. And I think that's the real missed opportunity for folks who just shun volunteering or bar service totally is, we have a lot of judges in our state who are big believers in all of that and are very fortunate to have that. And you want to talk about, the easiest and quickest way to get your name in circulation with judges is to go serve with them on a committee, whatever it may be. And so I think that's what the folks who criticize time spent volunteering with the bar or just getting involved actively in the bar and see the bar as a barrier instead of an opportunity. I think that's what they miss out on is, how do you get, where do you get some substitute for that? There really isn't one that I can think of. So that is a great point, but also important, in our state where we elect our judges, you can write a check and that's not necessarily going to get you anything. I think, everyone would agree it shouldn't get you anything, at least everybody on this call. Maybe others would disagree, but same thing for getting to know judges. You're probably not going to change the outcome of a case just because you have a relationship with the person making the decision. But I would say that what having that relationship does is they know who you are, and they know you're trustworthy, and they're going to listen to what you have to say. And if that affects the outcome of the case, okay, great. Those are, I think, important aspects of relationship building that you really just can't ignore because it's human nature.
I 100% agree with that. I think one of the best things I ever heard from a former FBI agent turned lawyer when I was a very young lawyer in Houston, Texas, was just a conversation in the elevator. Good facts win cases, bad facts lose them. And that was, his experience, 20-year field agent, went to law school, became an attorney in private practice doing defense work in Houston and Harris County. And that's a great lesson. And you're absolutely right, and things to encourage young people, right? There's a lot of gray hair now, but once we were the babies in the courtroom.
Yep.
And, you're up against some titans in the business. Everybody has that moment where they walk in a courtroom and there is one of the name partners at insert name a big firm. I mean, I have a memory of Herb Hammond being opposing counsel on a very contentious case. And, not only was he just an absolute professional, but I mean, quite a fierce advocate, quite a warrior, but also not unpleasant to be around to work with, right? He was somebody 20 years my senior, didn't have any reason to be nice, but was, right? Didn't have to be, but was. And a lot of great lessons from that relationship. And just a reminder that, I see a young male or female attorney in the courtroom. I'm reminded, hey, we were the kids in the courtroom once too. Just because the judge knows me by the first name, it means it's because I'm always here and he can't get rid of me yet. So, but you too will be in that spot one day. And then of course, welcoming the opportunity to get involved with the, or you're absolutely right. Joining a Rotary group, a lot of judges are involved. They have things that are near and dear to their heart. Judge Winters, I was telling you about. I think one of the reasons why we had a great friendship is not just because I was in his court a lot, but he would see me at the Rotary. And when I was in Canton, if it was Rotary Day, I'd go to Rotary, and that was his club. Now, his big club that he's passionate about in that charitable outreach is, if memory serves, his church, and also the Lions that they put on the big Christmas shindig in that community. But those are the ways, right? Being a member on that committee, and not because you're there to get something out of it, because you're there to give something, like that Dallas Bar Habitat. The goodwill that comes from that is going to benefit you 100 times over, whether that's being on the bar leaders committee, so you're planning out that next CLE, or one that I think would be a lot of fun, although I've never been able to make it because the last year we had a hurricane in Galveston. But that Texas Bar College CLE down in Galveston looks like it would just be so much fun and so much learning, and in a great area, great time of year. So one of these days I'm going to make that calendar work. But absolutely, those are reasons to get involved and take advantage, because you're not going to get that from, especially if you're going out and hanging a shingle, or you're trying to rely on self-study.
Right.
School of Hard Knocks, most expensive school you can be in, is that But we've all been there, right? And
Yep.
that's the one where the judge says that relief will be denied, Mr. Ashmore. Those are
Yeah.
those are
Well, those are important lessons too. Absolutely.
yeah.
Well, Casey, we're grateful for the time that you spent with us
Absolutely.
today, and just thank you for being willing to come on and chat with us. I think you know that our tradition here is to, before we wrap up, to give our guests the opportunity to share a tip or a war story for our listeners. Did you have something in mind?
Absolutely. This is the Texas Appellate Law podcast. So I'm going to say make friends with appellate lawyers is tip number one. I
We
have
like that tip.
We didn't
two
pay him
really,
to say that. Yeah.
really good friends who, again, tangential, how we ever even connected is, but Doug Gladden and Jason Niehaus have been friends for years. Jason and I met when he was a young graduate moving back home from the University of Miami, and he was at a firm, and then he went out shortly thereafter and became a solo, doing a lot of appellate work, and we've maintained that friendship. So those are relationships to have, because you're going to need a network of people you can bounce ideas off of, especially doing trial advocacy, because you're not going to be able to know it all. And then the other one is, if your goal is to sustain success, right, which is really the only kind of success that matters, is sustained success. 100% make sure that you are doing more than that minimum 15 or 20 hour CLE. And here's the story that that probably the most important one. A few years ago, trial lawyers in Texas, we had memorized the how to prove up attorney's fees script, right? It's kind of like when you're doing an agreed divorce, right? Judge, how long were they married? Well, they lived in the county for 180 days before the filing of, just something. Or when you're doing a prove up of a probate, right? You have memorized the script because you have said it so many times. And then the Supreme Court of Texas throws a wrench into everything by issuing a new opinion where we now have to use the lodestar method. And then the great debate, like, how is lodestar different from Arthur Anderson? And how do you work that into your prove up of your attorney's fees so that you can testify that they're both reasonable and necessary? And not being prepared for that, or getting a question cold from the bench because they happened to read it and the trial lawyer didn't, right? These are exactly the reasons why you want to stay close. You want to stay informed, and you want to do more than maybe even is recommended, simply because when you're pushing yourself and pushing those boundaries of what's expected, you're just going to be better. You're going to be able to sustain that success. So bar college, grab those Supreme Court updates. They may not all apply to you, but they're going to benefit you.
Oh, that's great. We always like to hear advice from a trial lawyer about keeping appellate lawyers close. So that's right. And of course, attorney's fees are a subject we've talked about a lot on our show. We recognize the importance of that. Well, Casey, thanks again for being with us. We appreciate your time, and I just appreciate what you're doing out there in small town Texas, practicing law and serving the community.
Thank you, my friend. It was great to connect with both of y'all. Thanks for the opportunity.